This week we're going to talk about learning. Watch this. Okay, I have a balloon. Now, what am I going to do with this balloon? Well, I have a needle. Are you ready? 1, 2. What happened? Did you flinch? Why did you flinch? We're going to find out. This is an example of what's called learning. Learning is a change in thought or behavior based on something you've experienced. In this case, flinching when I put the needle toward the balloon, we're going to learn as an example of classical conditioning. You have had the experience of the balloon pops and you flinch because it's a noise. So you're expecting it to pop. So you're flinching because it's a noise. Okay? You're flinching because of the noise. We're going to find out how that works. There are 3 different ways to talk about learning. There is classical conditioning, operant conditioning, and observational learning. Okay? The first one is classical conditioning. Classical conditioning deals with primarily involuntary behaviors, like flinching, like being scared, like things like that, like getting angry, like becoming more alert. Things that are involuntary, things that you're not necessarily consciously aware of. That is classical conditioning. And now, how do you learn those behaviors? Well, there's a couple big names in classical conditioning, and that's where we're going to start. We're going to start with a guy named Pavlov. Pavlov was a gentleman that was doing research on digestion. He had a biology degree. He was a biologist doing research on digestion, and he had these things hooked up to his dogs to collect spit. Well, he noticed, oh my gosh, my dogs are drooling before they even get food in their mouth. What's going on? Why are they drooling before they even get food in their mouth? He basically said this was a conditioned or learned response. Basically, the food in their mouth naturally made them drool, unlearned. The sound of the food in the bowl was related to the food in the mouth. So eventually just the sound of the food in the bowl made them drool. So he decided to do some other experiments to see what he could condition. And primarily things like a metronome and a bell. He would ring a bell right before he would give them food. So the dogs learned to associate the ringing of the bell with the food. So they ended up producing saliva just because of the ringing of the bell. Now, basically this is what's called an unconditioned stimulus. There's 4 parts to this. Unconditioned stimulus, conditioned stimulus, unconditioned response, conditioned response. The unconditioned stimulus in Pavlov was the food. Didn't have to learn it. Think of conditioned as meaning learned. Unconditioned stimulus was the food. Unconditioned response, salivating to the food. Conditioned stimulus was the thing like the bell. The conditioned response was salivating to the bell. That was Pavlov. That was what he was famous for. Then along came a guy named Watson. Watson decided, I want to see if this works on people. So he took a baby named Little Albert, famous Little Albert study, and he decided, can I condition or train this kid to be afraid of things that he normally wasn't afraid of? Found out the kid was not afraid of much, but he was afraid of loud noises. So every time he would go for this white rat, he would bang this thing and make a loud noise, which would make the little boy afraid. So eventually, the unconditioned stimulus was the loud noise. The unconditioned response was fear. He was naturally afraid of the loud noise. Didn't have to teach it, didn't have to learn it. So unconditioned stimulus, noise. Unconditioned response, fear. The conditioned stimulus, which was originally neutral, was the rat. He wasn't normally afraid of it. The learned stimulus was the rat. The learned response was fear to the rat. Notice the pattern here. The responses are generally the same, just to different objects. The unlearned, unconditioned response and the conditioned response generally are the same action, just to different objects. So that was little Albert. There are some discrepancies in the accounts in terms of exactly what he was conditioned to fear and what they did afterwards to try to uncondition him, to try extinction and things like that. But that was little Albert. In general, again, there are four things. There's the unconditioned stimulus, unconditioned response, conditioned stimulus, and conditioned response. So unlearned and learned. Let me do one more example that you all might relate to. Let's say, I'm going to use the coffee drinker example. Let's say you're a coffee drinker. Naturally, caffeine makes you alert. The unconditioned stimulus, caffeine, makes you more alert. Unconditioned response, alert with caffeine. Eventually, just the sight and smell of coffee makes you alert. Okay? So, the sight and smell of coffee is presented just before the caffeine all the time, and that's the key. The unlearned stimulus, unconditioned stimulus, is generally presented right before the conditioned stimulus is generally presented right before the unconditioned stimulus. So the sight and smell of coffee is presented right before the actual caffeine. So the unconditioned stimulus, caffeine, the unconditioned response, alert with the caffeine, the conditioned stimulus, sight and smell of coffee, the conditioned response, alert to just the sight and smell of coffee. That's, in general, classical conditioning. Well, you also have what's called higher order conditioning, which is taking it to another level. So let's say you are conditioned to become alert with the sight and smell of coffee. Well, let's say the sight and smell of coffee is always presented at the same time each morning. Eventually, you may become alert just at that time of the morning because it's presented with the sight and smell of coffee. It's taking it to another level. If little Albert was shown a toy car every time once he was afraid of the rat, every time he was shown the rat, he was shown a toy car. That would be higher order conditioning. Higher order conditioning is very difficult because it gets extinguished pretty easily because you do not have the initial unconditioned stimulus and response anymore. So it fades out pretty quickly, but it's possible. That's higher order. Then we have a couple other things that have to do with classical conditioning. One is stimulus generalization and discrimination. Stimulus generalization is widening the stimulus to broader things. For instance, little Albert widened the stimulus not to just a white rat, but he was also afraid of anything white and fluffy. If you had a little kid that was afraid of doctors because pain, fear, pain with doctor, fear with doctor. The unconditioned stimulus was the pain of the shot. The unconditioned response was fear at that. The learned or conditioned stimulus was the doctor giving the shot. The learned response was fear to the doctor. Stimulus generalization would be not just afraid of that doctor, but be afraid of doctors in general or people in white coats in general. That would be generalization. Discrimination would mean you're being really picky, that only afraid of that particular doctor. Or little Albert would be only afraid of that particular rat. Or Pavlov's dogs would only salivate at the particular tone of the bell that he rung. That's discrimination. Discrimination is being really picky. Generalization is widening it. So then we also have a couple other things. We have biological preparedness. And let me ask you, have you ever eaten something, got sick, and then just the thought of that food makes you nauseous? That's what's called taste aversion, and that's an example of biological preparedness. It's that we are, as human beings, we are naturally built to develop certain classically conditioned responses. Taste aversion is one of them. It is one of those things, call it evolution, It's one of those things of people who avoided foods that made them sick in the past were more likely to survive. So they passed on the trait. And we are naturally wired to do that. We are naturally wired to be aversive, that those foods are aversive or we dislike them if they've made us sick. So that's an example of biological preparedness. Other examples might be human beings are prone to have phobias of things that are actually dangerous, like snakes and spiders and things like that. It's in our biology. So the last thing I want to talk about with classical conditioning is spontaneous recovery. Let's say you are a coffee drinker, and let's say you decide to switch to decaf. Well, initially, you're going to become alert just with the sight and smell of coffee. If you've had that conditioned response that you become alert just with the sight and smell, the decaf's going to work. But after a while, that connection is going to be extinguished because the caffeine's not going to be there. So after a while, the decaf's not going to work. It's not going to make you alert. Well, let's say you switch back to caffeinated. Boom, that connection is going to come right back. That's spontaneous recovery. It's if you've learned it once, it doesn't take much to learn it again. Okay, it's in there, and it doesn't take much to learn it again. That's spontaneous recovery. So that's classical conditioning. It's looking at an involuntary response and how you associate multiple stimuli. So you're learning from your environment because you have an involuntary response to something, and then you link it to something else. All right, the next type of conditioning is what's called operant conditioning. Operant conditioning is voluntary behavior. Okay? So, I'm going to see if I can do this. Hey, dog, come here. Come here. Okay, he's not coming. I was going to get my dog to show you. Come here. Come here. Come here. Come here. Okay? Hey, sit. Hey, sit. 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 Hey. Sit. Okay, you notice he's not sitting. Why is he not sitting? And why, okay, if I held a piece of food up, would he sit? Because he's been trained. Okay, operant conditioning. Operant conditioning, the first things you think about is some of the experiments on animals. You have rats in a maze, and when you give them food, they will go to the end of the maze because there's a reward. Think reinforcements and punishments. My dog, food is a reinforcement. He likes food. He likes to eat. So, think about that. It's voluntary behaviors. It's voluntary for my dog to decide to sit. It's voluntary. Human beings do a lot of voluntary behaviors. I'm driving in my car and I decide to slow down. It's a voluntary behavior. I choose to do it. So operant conditioning is, why do we choose to do some voluntary behaviors based on the consequences of those behaviors? So, first of all, there's this law of effect. The law of effect says if you do a behavior and it gets a good response, you're more likely to repeat it. My dog sits when I tell him to, and he gets a piece of food, he's more likely to do it. Now, he didn't because he saw that the food wasn't there. He's not stupid. He saw that the food wasn't there. If I were to have a treat in my mouth, he would sit and give me paw. He would do it just like that because he sees the treat. The law of effect says if you do a behavior and you get a response, then you're more likely to do it. My dog has sat when he sees a treat and he knows he's going to get the treat, so he does it again. We study and we get a good grade, we're likely to study the same way again because it got a good response. Law of effect. You do something and it gets a good reaction, you're likely to do it again. If you smile at somebody and you get a good response, you're likely to smile at them again. That's the law of effect. Well, how does this all work? It works through what's called reinforcements and punishments. Reinforcements are things that increase behavior. Giving my dog food increases behavior. Okay? Telling a little kid, if you're good in this store, we can stop for ice cream, is going to increase the being good behavior. So reinforcement is something that will increase behavior. Smiling at somebody is going to increase the behavior that they were doing because it's telling them that you like that. So reinforcement is something that's going to increase a behavior. You can have positive reinforcement and negative reinforcement. Well, what's the difference? Think of positive and negative as mathematical, adding and subtracting. Positive reinforcement is adding something to increase behavior. I am adding food to increase my dog's sitting behavior. I am adding ice cream to increase a little kid's listening behavior. I am adding good grades to increase studying behavior. You see where I'm going here? You're adding something to increase a behavior. That's positive reinforcement. Negative reinforcement would be subtracting something to increase a behavior. So for instance, if I were to say, if I were to tell one of my kids, if you clean up your room, you don't have to do the dishes. The dishes is something they normally had to do. Okay? If you do what I want you to do, you're going to be ungrounded. I'm going to take the punishment away. That would be negative reinforcement. It's kind of like a double negative makes a positive. You're taking away something aversive in order to increase behavior. That's negative reinforcement. Reinforcement is increasing behavior. Negative means you're taking something away. Okay, punishment is decreasing behavior. So, if I want to decrease a behavior, let's say my dog was getting into something and I wanted him to stop. And I say, stop, no. My goal would be to decrease the behavior, okay? And I'm adding something. I'm adding stern language. If you have a little kid and you say, no, you're adding something to decrease a behavior, okay? That is positive punishment. Spanking, positive punishment, because you're adding pain to decrease a behavior. Negative punishment would be subtracting something to decrease a behavior. Taking away a toy. Telling your teenager, give me your phone. Okay? Or you can't go out with friends in order to decrease a behavior. That would be negative punishment. You're taking away something with the goal of decreasing a behavior. So, reinforcement is increasing a behavior, punishment is decreasing. Positive and negative means adding and subtracting. Now, how do we do this? Well, there's other things to take into consideration here. One is this idea of shaping. Let's say I wanted to train my dog to sit, but he's not even close to being able to do that behavior. How do I do that? Or let's say I want to train my dog to pee and poo in one little corner of the yard, and he's not even close to doing that yet. How do I do that? Well, shaping is this idea of reinforcing approximations to the behavior. In other words, I would say, come here. I would say, come here, dog. And I would call his name. And I would reinforce him just for coming and standing next to me. And then I would reinforce him for having his head higher than his behind. And then I would have to have him completely sit. Or if I wanted him to go in a certain side of the yard, I would say anywhere in the yard I would reinforce him. And then I would say, okay, you have to go in this certain side of the yard. So shaping is used in a lot of animal conditioning because animals aren't going to do a certain behavior. I use this sometimes in an on-campus class where I try to get students to turn off the light switch in the classroom. And we reinforce them for being in a certain half of the classroom, then a quarter of the classroom. It doesn't work as well on people because people think through it. I've tried this and the students are like, okay, what does she want me to do? And is thinking through all the possibilities of what they want me to do. Animals don't think through it that much. So it's that's why shaping is more used. But shaping is rewarding approximations to the behavior. You reward this much and then you up the ante and they have to get closer for rewards. Then we have, so that's shaping, primary and secondary reinforcers. Reinforcers, again, are things that would increase a behavior. Primary reinforcer would be things like food, attention, stuff that you really need, stuff that is basic to humans, food, water. That's primary. Secondary reinforcers are reinforcers that are only reinforcing because they're related to primary reinforcers. A very classic example of a secondary reinforcer is money. Money only means something because it gets you things. Okay? And so that's secondary reinforcer. Now, we're moving on to two other things. One is reinforcement schedules. It would be easy if you could reinforce every instance of a behavior. Every time a person does something, they get a reinforcement. It would be easy, and they would learn the association pretty quickly. However, that's not always possible, and it's not always advisable. So sometimes people use reinforcement schedules. In other words, we're going to reinforce a behavior, and this is positive reinforcement. We're going to reinforce a behavior, but we're only going to do it some of the time. How does that work? Well, there's basically 4 schedules. There is variable and fixed, and interval and ratio. Okay, so there is ratio. Ratio means after a certain number of responses. So for instance, after my dog sits 5 times, every 5th time I will reinforce him. I want to try to get my kids to make their beds. After every 3 times they make their beds, I will give them some kind of reinforcement. That would be a fixed ratio. Ratio, certain number of times. Fixed, it's always after the same number. So fixed ratio, always after the same number of times. Variable ratio would be after about that number of times. The classic variable ratio is slot machines, because you're going to get the payoff after a certain amount, but you never know when. So that's variable ratio, after a certain amount of pulls of the lever. So ratio is the behaviors. Fixed and variable means after always the same amount or after about. Interval is amount of time passed. So if I wanted to get my kids to make their beds, I might give them a reward every Saturday if they've made their bed. That would be a fixed interval schedule of reinforcement because it's always after the same amount of time passed. If I did it about once a week, but sometimes every 5 days, sometimes every 6 days, that would be a variable interval schedule of reinforcement. So, ratio and interval, ratio meaning amount of behaviors, interval meaning amount of time, fixed meaning always the same, variable meaning sometimes a little bit different, approximate. That's reinforcement schedules. The last thing with operant conditioning is what's called latent learning. Latent learning is when you've learned it but you haven't shown it yet, because you've learned it but you haven't been reinforced yet. They discovered this when they were looking at rats in a maze, and they let one group of rats explore the maze, but they didn't give them any reinforcements. They just let them explore, and they wandered around and so on and so forth. And then they compared how quickly those rats, compared to a group that had never seen it, learned the maze when given food. when given food, the rats that were exposed to it were able to get through it a lot quicker. So they had this what's called a cognitive map, and it was called latent learning because they had learned it, they just hadn't shown it. Another classic example of latent learning is tests. You learn stuff in school, but you don't show it until you take a test on it and show that you know it. That's another example of latent learning. So that's latent learning. So we have classical conditioning, which is involuntary behaviors and you're associating stimuli. You have operant conditioning, which is voluntary behaviors and has to do with a behavior and a response. And then the last piece of learning is what's called observational learning. And that's when we learn by watching others. So, how does that work? Well, first of all, I want to tell you about a guy named Bandura, who was known for modeling, which has to do with observational learning. He did an experiment on what he called Bobo dolls, which are those blow-up dolls that you punch and they go down and they come back up. And what he did was he said, if kids saw adults slamming those dolls and being aggressive and being rewarded for it, are the kids more likely to mimic that behavior? And the answer is yes. If the adults were being aggressive and they were reinforced for being aggressive, the kids would see that and they would be more aggressive too. It's called vicarious reinforcement and punishment. They're seeing somebody else be reinforced, or if you're seeing somebody else be punished, you're less likely to do the behavior. So you can have vicarious reinforcement and punishment because you're seeing somebody else get a response for behavior and you're learning from that. You're observing that. What does it take to imitate or model someone's behavior? Well, it takes paying attention. So that's the first thing. You have to pay attention to it. You have to be able to process it and remember it. So it has the cognitive ability of processing it and remembering it. You have to be physically able to do it. And then you have to want to do it. So you have to pay attention. You have to cognitively be able to remember it. You have to physically be able to do it. And you have to want to do it. I could want to learn how to do a soccer move. Okay? And I could be fully paying attention. I could be fully remembering the steps, but I could be physically totally unable to do it. And so I would not be able to mimic it, to imitate it. So a failure in any of those four parts could lead to a lack of modeling. If you're not paying attention, you're not going to pick it up. If you cognitively don't remember it, you're not going to be able to do it. If you physically can't do it, you physically can't do it. If you don't want to do it, you're not going to do it. So it's a motivation, it's a cognition, it's a physical thing, it's a lot of those pieces. Those are the steps. So that's observational learning. You're watching others and you're learning from their experiences. So that is learning. If I were to get some food, I could show you that my dog would actually sit and give paw, but that also gives you an idea of how learning is not as straightforward as you think. There are lots of pieces to it, even with animals.